Welcome. This is Julia Wahl in her podcast, How to Live. And today I have the pleasure being in conversation with Marco Adda. Marco Adda, who's an independent scholar, anthrozoologist, and will explain what that is in a moment. And also an expert on the behavior of dogs, including focusing on free-ranging dogs living in Bali. Is that correct, Marco? Or
It's
would you like to
fantastic.
add?
Yeah. Thank you, Julia. First of all, for having me here. And yes, absolutely, I'm really passionate about dogs for sure, and wolves, and anthrozoology. We will talk about that in a while, in a moment, and many other things like most importantly, somatic work, which at some point I've been integrating with my passion for animals and my passion for nature and ecology, right? So all of those patients are coming to a converging point somehow, and maybe we will unfold a little bit about that later. Yeah, thank you
Yes,
for having me here. Really, thank you.
my absolute pleasure, because you have many interests. So social science, cross culture, anthropology, psychology, ecology, neuroscience. Hopefully we'll be able to focus on these topics as well, or the topic of how you integrate these various topics and themes. But let's start with anthrozoology, a term that maybe some of our listeners might still not be familiar with. So, what is it, and what do you exactly do about the topic, Marco?
So anthrozoology is a multidisciplinary science or field of research, would say. So it integrates many disciplines, many sciences like psychology, ecology, animal behavior, human-animal interaction in general, and anthropology, of course, biology. So all of those disciplines are coming to an epicenter where they converge and they have a dialogue and they integrate the different perspectives to have a better understanding of the interaction or the conflict of human with animals and all the issues or benefits that are raised by all of those different interactions, right? So it's a new term. I mean, recently created term. So anthrozoology has a few decades as a interdisciplinary field, but is tracking it's getting attention, right? Is getting more and more attention, while the awareness for animals and the environment is also raising globally, right? So is becoming more and more needed, more and more important as a multidisciplinary field of research and exploration, right?
Mm.
So this is anthrozoology. And of course, within anthrozoology, the study and the understanding of human-animal interaction in cultures, in different cultures, in different epochs, in different contexts, in different environments, right? In different times of the history of humans and other animals. Within that general context, within that broad context, there are some main points that emerge, like, for example, the well-being of animals in those contexts where humans may use animals or exploit animals or organize some activities with the support of animals, for example, or so that may go hand in hand with animal welfare if you want, but not necessarily. It can cross animal welfare, but is not necessarily completely animal welfare because it expands in other directions too. Maybe if we will have time, we can go in some details. And for example, animal-assisted interventions, as I was mentioned a moment ago, those activities that integrate animals in those contexts where there is the need to support humans for some reasons, because there are some concerns. People maybe have stress and other burdens, right? So we integrate some animals into some therapeutics or therapeutic activities, or educational or recreational activities. So, like for example, in that case, anthrozoology um, looks at, examines how those animals are employed in those interventions, and what can be done to support the animal, to respect the animal, and to leverage the potential that the animal can bring into the picture, at the same time respecting the animal and supporting the persons and the people that are involved within that type of context, right? So the range where the range of anthrozoology is very large, is very wide, and but I just provided a few examples, but just to say to those who are not familiar with the term, that everything or almost everything that relates to human and animal interaction or conflict may go under that umbrella of anthrozoology. Anthro, human; zoo, animals; logy, the understanding of the interaction of humans and other animals. Humans as an animal, as animals, as animals themselves, or as animals ourselves, as inhabitant of this world, we are animals too, among other animals, or sometimes uh, against other animals, is the case to say, and we'll maybe dive into that later, right?
Because it's very important to say that we're also part of nature, and we are animals as well, and that's why we use these terms such as other than human animals, or um, more than human nature, or other than human nature. So
Yeah.
because we often have this tendency to say that we are in fact not part of nature, and we tend to throw everything into that bag. So we human beings, we're something special, and then when we say use the term nature, we put animals and insects and trees and everything inside that bag. So tell us a little bit about humans experiencing other than human animal suffering. So I am referring, of course, to anthrozoalgia. So algia, being meaning pain. So what is that, and what are some of the anthrozoological concerns? So a few questions here, actually.
Yeah, true. So, um, within the frame of anthrozoology, so the interaction of humans with other animals, within that frame, we can observe that some people, and we will see a few examples in a moment, and actually, it's not some, many people experience a certain degree of suffering, thinking or imagining or empathizing with the life of other species, which who we can call animals, right? But as well as we empathize with our own species, in some cases we may suffer for, let's say, people affected by a earthquake on the other side of the planet, right? And we empathize with them, and although that earthquake didn't hit our own coast, and so those people are very far away from us, but we empathize with them, and we may suffer, we may feel a certain degree of stress, or we may live that experience really dramatically, of those people losing their house, losing their farms, losing their families. People are dying maybe in that dramatic event, right? So we experience similar emotions for the animals. So, and this is something that I believe needs to be highlighted because it's not necessarily acknowledged. Certainly not is not necessarily is not acknowledged in all of its forms, right? So, anthrozooalgia, so anthro human, zoo animals, algia is the disease, distress of humans for other species, for animals. Comes in different forms. I give you just some examples. And by the way, this term, thank you for mentioning that. This term is a term that I've proposed in a conference in the Anthrozoology symposium in 2022 or 21, and then a paper has been published on this particular term and is downloadable for free. Later, we may give the coordinates if we recall it. And so, for example, just to give simple examples, something that people may easily may have experienced very easily. For example, suffering for animals that live in our homes, like a dog or a cat that is sick. That's a very tangible and immediate example of how a form of anthrozooalgia may manifest, right? May emerge, right? So a dog is sick, and maybe is at the end of life, maybe has a cancer, maybe it goes to the vet, and it's it's something going on with the life of that dog. The people in that family are experiencing anthrozooalgia, so they are suffering for another species, and they're empathizing with the pain of that other species. But not just those people; also people in the neighbor may know of that dog and may be affected by that event. Right? That's a very immediate, tangible example. But there are some other examples that are less obvious. Right? Like, for example, let's talk about icon animals, right? Animals that are killed by hunters, for example. I may make the case of the wolf, Spitfire, a famous wolf that was killed back in 2018, just outside, I guess, Yellowstone National Park. Or I can talk about the wolf Takaya, a beautiful wolf killed in Canada a few years ago in 2020, or Cecil the lion, also another famous animal killed by a hunter. So those events get spread through the social media and gather the suffer of many people worldwide that participate to that event. And that famous lion that people maybe knew because knew the stories of that lion, because the media before the tragical event were reporting, oh, now the lion is there, is helping, the presence of the lion is helping, for example, in supporting some conservational programs, or Takaya the wolf is roaming free, has been observed while fishing some salmon. So people enter somehow in the life of those animals. And when those animals are killed, we may feel really to have lost something that is close to our circle, is part of our family, right? And that's collective. That's a collective mourning. That's a collective suffering for an icon animal. And that's another form of anthrozoalgia, which is, for example, certainly is less acknowledged and than somebody suffering for a dog that is dying in their family, right? So we observe that phenomenon of people suffering for an icon animal, but we see it as more as a social outrage, a social, something happening in the social medias, and something happening, bouncing here and there in the press. But we don't see yet so clearly as a suffering of the community, the global community, in the particular case of icon animals known everywhere, is the global community that is responding to the loss of that animal and is suffering collectively, right? Similarly to what we do for the environment, for example. And in fact, there is a similar term from an ecological perspective for the environment, which may be solastalgia. When we lose an environment, it may be the case of ice melting in North Europe or somewhere else in Antarctica. You know, we embody somehow, we empathize and embody somehow that loss of wellness, in environmental wellness, right? We perceive that that disaster is coming, right? And we feel it in our body, and we feel it collectively. Collectively, we share that stress for the loss of a certain balance within the environment, right? Or we may feel, still speaking about ecology, when, for example, one of those boats transporting oils from a continent to another, oil or black oil, or get stuck in somewhere in the ocean and start to spread oil all around the ocean, and we know that that will kill fish and will kill biodiversity in that area, and will get transported by the waves and will affect a certain coast. It may be the case of radioactive disasters, as it happened in Fukushima a little bit more than a decade ago, 2010, 2011, those years. And we know that that affects the environment, and we collectively suffer for that, right? So that ecological distress that we embody somehow, and collectively we live and we carry and we suffer for. Similarly, it happens something similar when we think about animals. So icon animals, as I made that example, or animal in disasters, for example. Some people, I mentioned about disasters just to make an example of people suffering for other people. But in disasters, there are also many animals affected, right? We can think about what was Katrina, the big disaster happened in the US a few years ago, in Central America or North America, and all the animals dispersed in the earthquake, inundation of the coast. Or we can think about also more recently the war in Ukraine. The media were sharing a lot of pictures of animals affected by the war, animal dispersed, animals starving because the farmers had to leave their land, dogs or cats inevitably left behind because maybe we're not around when people have escaped their land, right? So through those news, through those information, people empathize immediately with the animal and carry with us that form of distress, and that's a form of anthrozoalgia. To not mention about, for example, animal consumption. Many people suffer, especially in the vegan community, suffer for the consumption of animals, right? And the abuse of animals in farms and in fact animal factories, right? You name it. There are many voices relating to anthrozooalgia, but yeah, summing up, anthrozooalgia refers to any type of suffering that one may be experiencing while thinking to other species. And to our listeners, if you ever had experienced any of that. Um, I just want for that to be acknowledged, right? Because you may have experienced that, and you may have people around that do not necessarily understand that. You may have a community around that do not necessarily understand that, and I'm also thinking to every type of people, but also in particular adolescents that uh, go through a very delicate stage, very delicate transition of their life,
Mm.
and may not have instruments, tools to cope with that suffering. And like, for example, a a good example of uh, uh, coping with that is wearing animal costumes. And it's a phenomenon that is spreading a lot around. It's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily reflect the suffering for the animals. It may be also a trend. There may be other reasons behind that. But if you look into the furries phenomenon, furries, Tarians, and other kin. So basically, people that feel to not be completely humans and
Mm.
mostly identifying themselves in other species. So they may wear some fox-like
Mm.
costumes and live their daily life with those costumes because they need to complete, they feel they want to
Mm.
complete their physicality, their body, the somatic expression of themselves
Mm.
with some sort of animalities, right? So there are cats, dragons, foxes, wolves, dogs, or other animals. They complete their body with some additional. It may be a tail, it may be a full costumes. They gather by them. They have some gatherings worldwide. There are gatherings of furries, and they're not just adolescents, but in the case of adolescents, for example, they may be discriminated because if they don't have a community around them that supports them and that understand them, they may be discriminated because of that. They may be discriminated for that diversity, and we need to recognize that diversity. So anthrozoalgia also integrates the case of furries
Mm.
to recognize their diversity and recognize that they suffer in that case of their of the impossibility or the difficulty of expressing their own animality. To some extent, they suffer for the animal within themselves that doesn't find a way to express into the world. And so, to cope with that suffering, they complete themselves
Mm.
with some elements of animality.
Mm.
That's the way I can express it, right?
Mm.
And there are many other examples, and I leave it there for now, so we can maybe expand or change a little bit the
Mm.
direction. But I
Mm.
think that gives an idea of what anthrozoalgia is.
So on a more a positive note, so to I don't want to use the word combat, but maybe help with this experience of anthrozoalgia, so this pain, this suffering. How would you, Marco, envision if you could envision that the best type of human and other than human, so animal coexistence? What would that look like? What would that entail?
I'm not sure if I have an ideal in that sense, but I am certain that if we redesign our spaces in a different way, our spaces, I mean our cities, the environment we navigate and we have conquered at the expense of other animals, right? So if we redesign our human dominated landscape and make it a little bit more inclusive, for sure we make space for um, a dialogue, for an integration with other species, a reintegration of ourselves within others, within nature, and in a more open dialogue with other species. That let's make a very simple example again. You may happen to walk around a urban area. It happens. I noted. I have the perfect lens to identify that. So it happens to me everywhere, and I'm always wearing those glasses. And and you see that there is a tree, or there is a line of trees in a street, and you look at the bottom, and you see that at the bottom the tree is just surrounded by concrete. So basically you have concrete, and there is the trunk of the tree coming out of the concrete, and then at the top there are the branches and the leaves, right? So this is a very tangible example, and that everybody can understand. The leaves of that tree theoretically should fall in the ground, re-enter in the ground, nourish the roots of that tree, and then the cycle continues. The life of that tree continues. The health of that tree continues. Not just the health of that tree. The tree probably brings some oxygen out, and so that relates to our own well-being, right? But not just to our own well-being. It relates also to the well-being of a dog that's living in that urban area, probably in a home with some people, because we, for some reason, we believe that dogs living in a home with the people have the best lifestyle. Is not necessarily the case. But let's make the case of a dog, a happy dog, having a wonderful lifestyle in a wonderful family, just living around the corner where those trees are, right? And so the humans of the dog go down the street to walk a little bit with the dog, to do some pee, some little poo, right? And so under that very tree, the dog still can sense some smells and may be inclined to pee there and to poo there, right? And because there is no space under the tree, it happens to be a pee and a poo on the concrete. And we perceive that as something disturbing or something invasive of our space, right? And there will be somebody on the other side of the street that will say, hey, pull up the poo of your dog, right? While in fact, the whole system is this, you know, is wrong at its root, right? Because under that tree there it would be needed that space for the life of the tree, for the oxygen that the tree provides to us, and for that dog to go there and negotiating with that little spot by leaving a signal, by putting his stuff there, which will also support nourish the tree, and will also facilitate the conversation with other dogs living in that neighbor. And so when that person turns the corner and go to buy some bread to the bread shop, and there is a dog of the other person coming from the other side of the street, what you see, because maybe those dogs didn't have the opportunity to interact, that they look at each other from the side of the street, that they start to stare at each other, maybe bark at each other. They cannot cross, they cannot dialogue, you know. And those two people may be pulling at their dog, right? And that's also a consequence of the fact that under that tree, there is no space for those dogs to leave their information and to initiate a dialogue with each other, where they can say to each other, hey, my name is Paul, I am a dog living there, you know. And the other dog leaves his information or her information and say, hey, my name is Julie and or Marco or
Mhm.
Francesco or whatever name, and okay, let's use dog names, but just to make it a bit more human, so people can empathize. But
Mhm.
Fido, what's the name a typical dog name Blackie or Drogo. Anyway, so those dogs start a dialogue within that
Mm.
little spot, right?
Mhm.
And so just imagine that couple of meters under that tree, the difference, the ecological, psychological,
Mm.
emotional difference that just those couple of meters under the
Mm.
tree would represent for the life of the human community, of the animal community, and for the life of the ecosystem.
Mm.
To not mention that on that trees there are birds living. Birds go there, and according to the health of the tree, birds go there, and maybe little worms live under the surface of the tree,
Mm.
and plenty of other lives
Mm.
lives live in on that tree and under that tree,
Mm.
right? So what do, we just conquer that little space. So we're not, just to give you an example of how
Mm.
just that little action of putting concrete around the tree has a tremendous impact
Mhm.
in the life of many, in the
Mm.
life of a community, of human community, animal community,
Mm.
and and in the well-being, which turns to become the bad being of
Mm.
many in that case.
Mhm.
So we need to reconceive our cities, our urban
Mm.
areas, our environments. We need to redesign that, understand those links, those
Mhm.
underlying links, and redesign what we have around us in a more inclusive way,
Mhm.
understanding that that tree, just to continue with our example,
Mhm.
is the house of birds. It
Mhm.
provides us oxygen. And yeah, just to conclude on that, we can rethink of our landscape, of our inhabited, human
Mm.
inhabited
Mm.
landscape, to not say dominated, but inhabited landscape, and redesign it with
Mm.
animals in mind, with ecology in mind, with the environment in mind. And that will, little by little, pave the way to an epoch
Mhm.
which somebody has defined as the symbiocene, where we have an interaction, a relation, a more symbiotic
Mhm.
interaction with other species. Symbiotic, like we empathize with each other,
Mm.
we and we reflect as humans. We reflect ourselves into other species, and we learn from other species, and we have a dialogue, a negotiation with other species, right?
Mm.
Is probably a different measure that we need to find, because as we are now in many places, we have just isolated ourselves from other species. There are places where that's not the case, where there is more integration
Mm.
with other species. Not
Any
necessarily. Yeah, go ahead.
and
Go ahead.
any good examples, Marco?
Oh, I've been living for a short while in California, for example,
Mm.
in the Berkeley area, and there is a huge park just outside Berkeley areas, right? And when you walk at dusk, in the
Mhm.
evening, after sunset dusk, at that time, you see deer coming out, you see
Mm.
coyotes coming out.
Mm.
It's a bit scary in some cases.
Mhm.
You need to be aware that those living beings may cross what's conceived as your human
Mm.
environment, right?
Mm.
That's a liminal, a border, where
Mhm.
those two communities, many communities, the
Mhm.
communities of humans, the communities of coyotes, the communities
Mhm.
of deer, the communities of uh, other big birds coming
Mhm.
there, just in the streets next to the cars, right? And in fact, in those areas, if you happen to have a cat at home, it's better to keep the cat inside at night, because it may be dangerous, right? So also that degree of awareness, even though that's a concern, it's a concern based on the nature of other species being around. They're not ugly, they're not bad and ugly. They have their own nature, right? And so you embody that nature, you integrate that nature, you are aware of that nature, and you adjust consequently. And that becomes a negotiation. And that's just to mention, like, for example, that's the case of California, of that specific spot of California. There are many other spots of California, areas of California or the US, where you can find that loose borders where humans and animals may and other animals, those two landscapes may merge somewhere in between, and they have a border where they cross each other, right? But it may be the case of Indonesia, where I've been living also for many years, and let's say in Bali, for example, and where you wake up and you have a snake in the backyard, and no problem, you move a stick and the snake goes away, and you have free ranging dogs come around. The gardens are open, it's very likely that there is no gate, no borders, no fences, right? And so you may wake up and you have a chicken over there that maybe is flying from the farmers 20 meters away from you, is leaving somebody with a chicken, and the chicken comes there, and maybe a little cow pass by, or it may be the case of other places, India or other countries, where there is there's no such a neat and sharp separation between among humans and other communities, but they are more somehow integrated. And let me say something on this. This is very important to me, because somebody may think, oh, right, because those places haven't gone yet through the same, or certain places, it's not the case of California, but let's say India, Indonesia, or Bali, for example, those places are still in their process throughout a certain degree of civilization, right?
Not as civilized
No,
as
not
we are.
civilized, as we are, right? And then let me tell to all the people listening, let me tell to all those who believe that way, right? I'm sure me and you are not in that side of the barricade, but we are more open. But long story short, I believe that a place, a culture, a geographic zone, a geographic area, country, if you will, integrating animals that way into the life of people, it's a way more civilized place than those places we believe to be civilized, where there are no animals around, where the trees are constrained by concrete and so on, right? So probably it's just a different narrative from the past. In the past, probably civilization was intended as removing animals from our lives, controlling nature, escaping nature, escaping the unpredictability of nature, the unpredictability of wilderness, right? Where we are now, civilization, if we still want to use that term, provided that it's still appropriate, I'm not sure it is, but in case we want to use it, it goes the opposite direction. You want to civilize that place, you need to reintegrate free-ranging dogs there. You need to reintegrate certain species there. You need to provide more space for species to roam around those areas where humans live. That's where civilization should go now, right? Towards that integration.
So let's focus on free-ranging dogs because that's one of your topics, interests. Because this sounds like a scary idea to some of us, and or actually something that's not very ethical because not very caring. Because of course we should take care of these dogs. Adopt them. So, what's your opinion or experience in that topic, Marco?
Dogs have been living alongside humans for millennia, right? Uh, and that's probably because at a certain point, wolves or the proto dog or a certain canine, that's probably the ancestor of both dogs and wolves as we know them today, approached, or we approached them, or they approached the human villages, right? And so little by little, through the process that we call domestication, that means domus home. So the process of bringing dogs to our home, right? Human-centered concept itself, domestication. We have more and more restricted those animals, and we have developed that understanding, that belief that the more those animals are under our own control, even though we can call that care, the more they live, the better they live, right? That's, I'm sorry for many that are strongly believing that, but that's not, let's be a bit more diplomatic, right? That's not necessarily the case. That's not always the case, right? So first of all, we need to look at numbers. We have about 1 billion dogs in this planet. And out of that 1 billion, probably 150 million, less than 200 millions live as pet companions. So it's 1/5 of the global dog community living as pet companion in those civilized world.
Italy, Poland, of course, we are very civilized here.
Yeah. So most of the canine community lives free roaming. And most of them are very happy with that. Most of them have their freedom that way. It's important to understand that not all the dogs that live free roaming are abandoned dogs, which may be the case in some areas. A dog that is free roaming is escaped from a home, got lost, or has been abandoned on a street. So he's free roaming, but you can see that that dog is going through a certain distress, is disoriented, is confused. So that dog may need some help to be identified, relocated, adopted, and live with a nice family. Better family than those who have abandoned that. It happens. It is the case, and I am, just to clarify it, I am on the forefront of that advocacy. I support that when is the case. But not all the dogs living free have been abandoned. Those are dogs that have been free forever. They are born on the street, they live on the street, they die on the street. The street or the suburbs of the land or the countryside or the wood or the beginning of a forest or whatever environment they may live in, that's their home. We don't have to do that mistake of believing that free-ranging animals needs to be taken away from their environment and relocated in human homes. To do what? Especially thinking, to do what? Live on a sofa for 9 hours at home, alone by themselves, while we are working in an office? We need to renegotiate this idea, right? So we need to understand that dogs, we need to understand it and accept and integrate that into our perception. the dogs have the right to live free where that's allowed, where that's possible, where that's tolerated. They have the right to live free, and if they need help because they're injured, we may still support them. But the fact that they live free doesn't equate, is not an automatic equation for being abandoned or being in need of help. And certainly is not the case when there is a happy mom giving birth to some puppies in a cave just outside a city, and those puppies are with their mom. That's nature, is doing its course. You may want to provide some food to support, for example, if that's the case, with the support or with the help or the assessment of a professional will be better. But, and I'm not saying to do it, just making an example, that's a way to help. But for example, somebody may be inclined to say, oh, poor puppy, they are in the street, they need a home, and they go there and take the puppy away from the mother. What type of humanity is that? So we need to rediscuss certain approaches that we have with the free ranging dogs, and understand that they live free as free ranging birds live free, right? People we didn't develop that same obsession with giving a home to birds, right? We don't climb trees to say, oh, this abandoned bird on the tree, we need to find a house for him or for her, for those cute puppy birds, and we bring it home and we put them in a cage. We haven't developed that same obsession with other species as well as we have developed with dogs, for many reasons, and we will need another episode to unfold those reasons. But it goes with saying, I totally empathize with what people want to do for animals and for dogs in particular. And I recognize their good intentions. I recognize the help that people want to bring to other species and to animals and to dogs in particular. But we need to be open and ready to rediscuss that the approach that we are having is not comprehensive. It doesn't come with a broad understanding of what we are doing within that environment. And actually, the help that we may be providing, it may turn out to be more damaging for those animals than supportive for those animals.
Some of the things you're saying, I think, might be difficult for some of us to accept, because again, we think it's about empathy and caring for these animals. That we take them home. But it's interesting to be looking at this issue from quite a different angle, Marco.
Yeah, and again, I respect and acknowledge the great intention of many people wanting to help animals. That intention, we need to save that intention. What we may need to adjust in certain situations is the perspective and the type of action that we are going to have, right? We need to be humble and just for those who are listening also, just to sit quietly and recognize that the help that we may want to provide sometimes is based on anthropocentrism. We believe also in that action that we're going to have, in that type of process, and that type of approach, we may still carry the heritage of anthropocentrism, thinking that we humans are somehow at the center of everything, and we are not. With that, I'm sorry. I want to be simple as straight as possible. We are not at the center of everything. We are a species among other species in a planet, and we need to integrate ourselves with other species and respect other species for what they are. In the case of dogs, we have developed such a strong bond throughout millennia, and with that bond come a lot of projection, of psychological and emotional projection that we put into those animals, into dogs, right? So sometimes saving them is also a way to fulfill some needs that we have. We need to think carefully about that. We need to take away all of those elements and look at the situation as it is and understand the ethology, the ethogram, meaning the what are the behaviors of a certain animals, in this case a dog, what really that animal needs, that species needs, and try to do our best, basing our support to those animals on what those animal needs, and not on what we assume, in some cases for our own fulfillment of what those animals need, right? So we need to renegotiate a little bit that. And again, let me reiterate that again. If you are listening to this, those comments in this podcast, and you somehow feel touched by those words because you maybe are advocating for saving animals from the street, or nurturing animals because they reproduce and they become uncontrolled numbers, don't get upset. Just for the love of animals that you are claiming to advocate for, right? To advocate for that love of animals, just sit a moment and rethink of your action and rethink of your position and try to understand more about dogs and other animals and see if what you're doing is appropriate or it can be done differently otherwise, right? According to the life of those animals, according to the environment they live in, right? Because in some cases, some dogs may really need support and be medicated. They may need medical help. They may need assistance, emotional assistance. They may need to, you may want to bring a dog at home and provide a shelter and then find an adoption for their dogs. But doesn't necessarily apply. That doesn't apply to all the cases, right? In many cases, it doesn't apply. In many cases, those dogs are happy living by themselves, free, which doesn't mean that they are isolated and they still interact with the human community to some extent, but they have their freedom to roam around, to choose where they sleep, where to eat, where to travel, where to navigate, what is their, technically speaking, home range area or territory, if you will, right? And they negotiate with other dogs, they negotiate with other animals around, they take care somehow of the surroundings because they have a social function also, they have a political function within their environment. They warn if somebody new comes around, they warn, they bark if something happens, they check on people. They may have a function within a village, for example. I've been observing that for years in Bali by studying free-ranging dogs in Bali. Dogs within a community, village dog within community dogs, if you want to call them. They roam around a certain village. They know everybody. They greet. They don't greet. They do what they want. They sleep one day there. They sleep one day the other side. They live free. They are very healthy. The community knows them. The community accept them. And if somebody approaches it happened so many times. Somebody robbing in the house of somebody, and the free-ranging dogs alerting people because of that, or somebody new coming for bad intention in that area, the fringing dogs identifying that person, people coming out, what's going on, and those intruder were escaping, right?
Mm.
So we also, just to say, to expand even further the discussion and say that dog, they're not just there for, they're not just poor animals with no purpose in life and no destiny. They find their purpose by
Mm.
living their life free.
Mm.
They may find their purpose within their canine community.
Mm.
They may find their purpose within a human community, or both in canine and human community. Of course, in some cases, some interventions may be needed to
Mm.
support some dogs, to address some issues, but we need to be
Mm.
open-minded, learn a little bit more about dogs, and uh, negotiate a little bit
Mm.
our perspectives.
So I have two last questions for you,
Yeah,
Marco, if you don't mind. So
absolutely.
first of all, so what are your some of your recent or current activities to do with anthrozoology? Facilitating this coexistence of us humans and other animals, for instance.
Yeah, for example, I'm working on a model uh, called canine participated somatic experiencing,
Mm.
where as I was mentioning at the beginning, I have a strong involvement in somatic
Mm.
work, body mind work,
Mm.
uh, like yoga, martial arts,
Mhm.
qigong, and experiential learning through body,
Mhm.
and so on, among others. So what I'm doing is integrating my work with canines, with dogs, into those somatic contexts, right?
Mm.
So in this model that I'm exploring, I mean, it happened to me to explore many years ago, a few decades ago, a couple of decades ago, but uh, it wasn't it wasn't clear to which direction it was going, and there were way less studies on
Mm.
canine cognition.
Mm.
We knew so little about canine cognition and many other and neuroscience
Mm.
and the many results also on the well-being of
Mm.
people provided by yoga and other
Mm.
somatic practices that we have nowadays, right? So now there is more literature, there are more
Mm.
point of reference, right? So I'm reproposing and readjusting that model now,
Mm.
and integrating dogs, inevitably starting from dogs because this is the species I know, one of those I know better,
Mm.
and integrating dogs in workshops where
Mm.
people come and explore their physicality, their
Mm.
somatic resonance with each other or with the environment when we work outside. And so integrating a dog into those
Mm.
uh, workshop and experiences,
Mm.
that comes with some uh, guidelines, let's say.
Mm.
So people doesn't have to interact with the dog until a certain point, otherwise
Mm.
we trigger certain dynamics
Mm.
that the dogs may know already. We
Mm.
need to leave more space for the dog to explore
Mhm.
what's going on around and express herself or himself accordingly. So in other words, do not expect that the dog comes into the room and people goes to the dog and say, "Hey, cute dog,"
Mhm.
and the dog would apply the same behavior that knows already when people does that type of behavior. So we need
Mm.
to change the behavior of people to see what different behavior of the dog
Mm.
unfolds, right? And so we
Mm.
see, for example, that go the dog goes around the space, explore the space, and little by little, while
Mhm.
getting confident with what's going on around, because people in the meanwhile is doing practical work, exercise, physical activities, the dog start to find a way to integrate himself or herself within what's happening around, right? In some cases, sniffing people coming around. In some cases, sitting when people are in circle, for example. I have observed, this is just a pilot study, but a pilot exploration, but uh, already we have observed interesting things. Like, for example, we sit in circle and to discuss what happened in a certain episode, in certain actions, or to share some emotions, some feelings, and we leave a space within the circle for the dog, without calling the dog. And the dog is maybe sitting on the other side of the corner of the room. And because we are calm now and discussing, and maybe the dog before was sitting in the corner because we were agitated and doing some jumping and something, and maybe the dog didn't feel to participate to that, and staying quietly in the corner of the room, as any other participant can do, human or non-human, right? And then we sit at the center of the room, and we go in circle, and we leave a space because there is another participant in the room that at this moment is not participating in the circle, but we leave the space. And bang, a few minutes later, the dog comes and lie down there like that, with the pose, the head, very alert, looking around, lying down there in his spot, in his supposed spot in the circle, for example, right? So, bottom line, we need to subtract ourselves from the picture somehow. We need to, we may need to do way less, and we may need to leave way more space for other animals, dogs in this case, to express themselves without triggering the usual mechanism, the usual pattern, the usual paradigms, but leaving space for other people or other animals to express themselves according to certain circumstances, right? So I'm exploring that model. There will be a first paper coming out in October, because I presented that experience at the Anthrozoology Symposium in 2022. So a paper for that presentation will come out in October 2023, and I will keep working on that. Like, for example, here where I'm happen to live here now, we do some yoga and qigong and somatic work, body and movement work on the seashore, and people come and with their yoga mat, or we create a little space, little circle, and we start to do some activities, right? And some of those participants have dogs, so sometimes they come with a dog, and so equally I take somehow advantage of that. I suggest, okay, put the dog in safety, because we are in an open space. We don't have this is not a typical setting. We are doing something else. It's not a typical setting for canine participated somatic experiencing, which comes with many guidelines when I have the opportunity to set up that specific setting, right? But still, I can leverage that situation and see what the dog does, right? So I suggest, okay, put the dog in security, see where he wants to stay or she wants to stay, and then leave her there. And if you can, I asked the person of the dog, if you can, if the dog at a certain point is curious of what we are doing, because maybe we are doing the downward facing dog pose, yoga pose, like, so we are all in with the 4 feet and hands down and bottom up, right? So we look more like dog. Who knows? Maybe the dog becomes curious. It's often the case, right? And if the dog is curious and wants to come around, uh, don't don't stop her. Don't stop him. Let him check what we are doing. Let him or her explore around and and experience. Don't stop the experience of that animal because supposedly is disturbing, is supposedly it may be a threat. Of course, provided that as a dog is a nice dog, is a calm dog. It's typically the case, right? So that's another way to explore that, to get some little inputs, basically, to that I will use later when I will set up again a specific setting for that type of procedure, which I want to explore more and understand more, on what happens to dogs and people within that type of context. Because the observation is, again, within that context, the observation is on the dogs and on the people, what people do also in response to the presence of a dog, right? For example, we have observed that when there is an emotional release throughout somatic experiencing, and the dog is doing by himself or herself in the corner of the room, so let's say is inactively observing and participating, and there is an emotional release, the dog come comes to the person and sits around the person who is crying or expressing emotionally something. The dog comes around, or may have that's something that may happen. The dog comes around and sit around, or maybe licking that person in the face, right? And there was a moment in this workshop we did in Italy, almost a bit more than 1 year ago, where there was a young lady crying, like a fountain. She was crying a lot, and she was having an emotional release. And that's necessary in a somatic workshop. That's necessary. That's why we do a somatic workshop. That's why I propose and lead the somatic workshop, to help people. And that's why people come to a somatic workshop, somatic experiencing workshop, to express themselves and to release some patterns, some old patterns, something that they are holding, some trauma, some you name it, right? So, and there was this moment where this young woman was crying a lot, and the dog comes around. So, as I say, that the guidelines are don't interfere with what the dog is doing, and so the dog comes around and start licking the girl on the face. And while the dog licks the girl on the face realizes that the dog is supporting her, and look at the dog and start crying even more. And so that exponential release happened. And at that point, a couple of other person in the group go there and start to pull the dog back, because they associate that further crying as something negative, as a suffering, right? That's an old pattern. That's something instinctive that we have, right? While in fact, the function of that moment, it was for that girl to express herself and what she needed to release, right? So again, going back to what I was saying, we need to observe the behavior of human, because humans too may have the assumption that something is not good, and is better to make an intervention. And that goes back to what we were saying with the dogs in the street, right? We may have the assumption and so we need to intervene, we need to do something. Well, in fact, we need to observe and let things to express themselves as they need to get expressed in a certain moment.
So
And
maybe,
lastly, just to conclude on that, all of that can apply to dog training and dog behavior
mm,
consultation. That's part
mm,
of my work,
mm,
of my professional life as dog trainer and behavior consultant. Mostly, I teach to my clients to do less and observe more.
mm,
And mostly, in many cases, let's say 80% of the cases, when people learn to do less and observe more and let things happen and observe and do just the right intervention at the right moment and take out of the picture the many things that we do with the good intention but maybe
mm,
are not necessary in that moment, right? Just by doing that, just by shifting the behavior of people, many um, dog training aspects are improved, or maybe many dog behavioral
mm,
issues are solved just by doing that. And what does that mean? That basically a dog in that perspective becomes the opportunity for us to look at ourselves, to look at our behavior,
mm,
to sit within ourselves, to observe ourselves, to transform ourselves,
mm,
to be more mindful. So that's the way how the presence of a
mm,
dog in our life can become a mindful experience, an experience of
mm,
mindfulness, if you want, right? I'm sure we
mm,
can talk a lot about that, but just to offer some inputs
mm.
there. Yeah.
So I think, Marco, you've actually answered my very last question, which is how to live. So I think there are quite a few things we can rethink and then start redoing. So doing in a different and maybe different way. Using or applying different patterns. So, thank you so much for an inspiring and I think in a way also provocative conversation. Uh, looking forward to our future conversations because I still think that there are so many more topics we could be discussing here today or in the near future. So thank you so much, Marco. It's been a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you so much, Julia. And I'm looking forward to talk again. And I'm sure too that we have many more
Mm.
things to share. And our listeners also, your listeners also, may be curious on many other aspects. So looking forward to it. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good life to you, Marco, and to all of our listeners. Thank you.
Bye.